Shut up and sit down.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. As always, I'm your host, Vincent Freeman, joined by my good friend Bruce. Bruce, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Always glad to be here.
And we have a special guest today. We have the founder of Faithless Hijabi, Tanzanian ex-Muslim atheist activist, as well as host of the Life After Islam podcast, Zara Kay. Thanks for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate it, Zara.
Thank you. It's Tanzanian. We've
Oh
always
my God.
had this. No. I have always had this with Americans on pronunciating Tanzania. A lot of them are like Tanzania, and I'm like, nope. But people have told me I pronounce it wrong as well. So I think it's open to interpretation, or I guess open to pronunciation in this case.
On behalf of all Americans on the planet, I sincerely apologize. We're the worst with English pronunciations. And I guess I was just thinking of the Tasmanian tiger or something like that. I don't know. But yeah, okay. I'll
do our
pronounce it
best
correctly.
We'll do our best to keep our barbarous pronunciations to a minimum.
Yeah, so how's everything going on with you over there during the pandemic? I know that's here in the United States, we started reopening up just a few weeks ago, and then we're closing up once more.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of places in the UK will open up on the 4th of July. A lot of people are making plans and celebrating. It's an American thing, so I don't understand why the UK is so hyped about it, because when I was in Australia, we weren't as hyped about the 4th of July. Nobody really cared. Maybe because there's a large population of Americans here, but also I think with the pandemic, everybody just needs time to celebrate. I'm not entirely sure how that's going to measure out, whether they're going to have 2 meters distance in pubs, or they do takeaways now. So a lot of the restaurants are open, and they do takeaways. In terms of businesses, people who work in the office have been told to work from home. And I think the long-term plan is to have flexible working, even more than they did before. So hopefully it will, I think the pandemic will change working culture as a whole.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic of conversation right there. We were talking about this a little bit before we started recording, but sort of the question of how much do we value economic prosperity versus how much do we value human life. It's a very difficult equation to sort of get your mind around it, but I think it's an important topic of conversation that we have to deal with. So for me, it's yeah.
Sorry. No, I was going to say, I think it gets even more complex when we're talking about developing countries, especially Tanzania and like East Africa in general. There are a lot of things that rely on it. People will literally die if they don't make money or have food, but then a lot of people will die because of the virus, and their death will be unnoticed because it's such a large population. The medical facilities aren't that good. So my family and I would travel overseas for that. If we had any big surgeries, we would rather do it overseas than in Tanzania. But at the same time, it seems it is really hard if our president is a democratic dictator. He's now very authoritative, but also is a believer in God, like a staunch believer. And basically, his suggestion was go to the churches, nothing about social distancing. He's like, God's going to save you. The churches are open. And our neighboring countries like Kenya and Zambia have been really, I guess they don't like his way, so they've closed down their borders. They're like, we don't want the disease, so we're going to close down borders. And I think there's an ongoing, I guess, battle where people are stuck in between the borders, like for trade, because we do a lot of road movement for trade instead of, I guess, ship as well, but instead of like flights.
Yeah, it's so weird. This is generally something that you'd expect coming from the United States because we're the only first world country that is predominantly religious, and especially since we're currently under the presidency of Donald Trump, which is the strangest thing for an American nowadays. But it seems like the United States, we've descended into chaos these past couple of weeks. So it's not enough that we have to deal with the pandemic. Now we're undergoing a seemingly huge social change, and I've never seen society so torn before. So what are people's thoughts on the USA outside of the country? So like what is your view on the United States now?
Yeah, I mean, one, I am really glad I'm not American. Moving to the US was my dream in 2016 before Trump was elected. And the moment he was elected, I'm like, nope, I am never moving there. Um, and I think a lot of, so I feel like coming from not just the UK, but coming from a background like my family is in Tanzania, and when I talk to them or the environment there, their Western worldview is built around only Americans, nothing about Australians, how Australia or New Zealand have done better in the pandemic, or how worse it is for the UK and Spain, but it is still better in other parts like Sweden didn't have a lockdown at all. So their worldview is all based on the entire, the West is America, and all their stats are based on America. So I think, any of the social changes that are happening, um, they see it on a one sided. They're like, hey, the West is crazy. They're doing this, they're doing that. And I'm like, yeah, but, in the UK, we still have a lockdown. And I think they don't see it as much. But coming back to, I guess, being Australian and then living in the UK, I think what we see now is we're conflating, especially the BLM movement, racism in the US to be applicable everywhere. And when I say this, I mean people who blame white people in the US. They think this happens everywhere. Like in Australia, we don't have that much to that degree. In the UK, I feel like it's not Black people that are racially discriminated as much as brown people, including myself. And in Tanzania, I think people just don't see the racism that is in their country that doesn't come from white people or most of East Africans. And my mom's Kenyan, so I follow both news. But I think it was a Kenyan politician who said, in Kenya, we're not scared of white people hurting us. We're scared of people from our own race hurting us. And I think a lot of people, outside Africa or who've never seen Black people being in power and not being minorities don't have that perspective. So I remember one of the person supporting BLM, or many of the people supporting BLM, said there's no such thing as Black people being racist. That's reverse racism, because, and that doesn't exist because they're not in power and you can't oppress them. And on my side, where I grew up, I was constantly racially abused for not being Black. And it could go from sexual harassment, maybe that's because I'm a woman, or maybe because I am a lighter shade of their color, or it comes to like the police just stopping you because they think Indian, fairer people, and that could be white people as well, have more money. And they'll stop you and they'll check your car and everything is fine. They're like, oh, you didn't turn on the indicator when you were stopping, or like when you were cutting lanes for 5 seconds or more. So they will try finding a fault so that you can bribe them because they think you're rich and you're not going to go through all the legal systems in terms of going to the police and actually getting a ticket. And I'm sure this has changed over time, but the racism hasn't moved. But for me to then say that, because brown people were not in power and Black people were in power, we couldn't be racist to them, it's intellectually dishonest because I feel like I have grown up around racism coming from both sides. My family would never sit on the same table as Black people. Um, and we had maids that were Black people, so that could be a hierarchical discrimination, but there are more racial discrimination that happens regarding their color. It comes to trust, it comes to culture, it comes to the differences in, I guess, how they see patriarchy. So, covering women up, not covering them up. Both Africans, like in Tanzania, they are quite conservative, at least when I lived there and visited. They are quite conservative, just like the Muslims, but um, their dressing is obviously not always long sleeves. Um, and they listen to music, and they could be Muslims, but they listen to music, and that is like a mix of the Islamic culture, but still the African culture being quite dominant. In my case, I had a very mixed Indian, Arab, more of a Muslim culture. We didn't adopt many things from Indian culture as much as other Hindus have, like um, the native people in India would have. So I think that, when people think of racism in the US and they go like, yeah, but the US has a problem, and they conflate it to be the whole world's problem being the same. I think they're forgetting a different perspective that when Black people are in power, other people have been racist towards them. And there is racial discrimination, especially in political power. There aren't many brown people in political power. And that could be maybe because I'm pretty sure there has to be interest, but there could be maybe because there's tribal voting. So something that works in Kenya is you're not going to vote for somebody who's the fittest president or the prime minister. You're going to vote for people who come from your tribe. So it's a lot of based in tribe, a lot of based in what tribe you're from. But so that's why, even if you have political parties who have brown people elected, I've never seen anybody win the election. I think the US had Obama, but I've never seen anybody even get close to it in Tanzania or ever have been. And we've been there for at least 5 to 6 generations. And there isn't enough representation, but I don't think the world has enough perspective on it. And coming from somebody who has been a minority, I've also seen how segregated my culture was from the Black culture. I never had a lot of Black friends, and I was never exposed to uh, African like traditions or music, TV shows, or anything until I lived on my own and I moved to Malaysia, then Australia. That's when I actually got into it because I had the freedom to do that. Otherwise, it was insular communities. So despite my family being Tanzanians, and they wouldn't call themselves Indians, they would call themselves, we're from Tanzania, but we have an Indian background. And they still pride themselves at being Tanzanian Indians versus Indian Indians. But I don't think they've embodied any of the African culture or the Tanzanian culture as it used to be.
Well, the entire world is just really up in an uproar and a mess right now because, as you discussed, like everyone, like, no one fits neatly into any single one cultural identity, and like a lot of people just seem to be ignorant about how, like, how racism actually works. It's not just about um, white on black racism. The racism exists in this weird intersection of so many different ethnicities, having different perspectives and whatnot. But Zara, you and I have spoken offline, and we've it really does appear that the entire Western world has just been completely overtaken by this tsunami of complete chaos by George Floyd's murder, and like, we see people taking to the streets, making these demands for change, and we're just caught up in this flood of moral outrage. And somewhere in that flood, there's this little voice called reason that just gets swept up in this huge, massive hysteria. Now, this isn't something that just came out of the blue. It's a problem that's been years in the making, with any discussion touching, however slightly, on race, sexuality, genetics, what have you, just being off limits to the polite individual. And we see this as far back as when Ben Affleck just went off on Sam Harris and Bill Maher years ago for making a very nuanced argument about Islam. Now, that kind of circumstance in particularly liberal circles, which I consider myself a part of, is made the cultural atmosphere so dry that the Floyd murder was the spark that just set the entire environment ablaze, because it's been saturated by the gasoline of political correctness and just allowed this entire environment to be turned into an inferno. Now we're seeing the consequences of a lack of these discussions in the form of these extreme demands for change to our institutions because of moral outrage, and reason is just nowhere to be found. Now, we spoke previously about if is it possible to talk sense to someone if they value reason. even if they have a different perspective than ours. Like, do you think it's possible? Like, what's been your experience like been like in that regard?
Um, Initially, before everything happened in BLM, I was always under the idea, especially within atheists or extremism, which was predominantly my environment, that because we've left a religion and we embodied reason and rationality, that we would be able to do it in other discourse, even if we didn't completely agree on something. There has to be something as a baseline. There has to be some form of our values that we do agree on. And I thought we could start from there, but it's become more complex than it is now. I feel like the pandemic didn't really help because it set a lot of people back from what they would do every day, and it kind of gave, and the protests and the BLM movement kind of gave them a bit more of a spark to start the fire. So I think people who are really bored ended up starting, and maybe bored, but ended up starting an outrage that moved the goalpost to something completely different than equality and more towards superiority. Also, not, George Floyd's death was, it's been politicized. It's been politicized more than what a lot of people had initially thought about, because they thought that George Floyd stands for a lot of other Americans that have been unfairly targeted by the police. And that, all the other people who have been called, I remember being there, some cases being that there were some African girls who went to Airbnb and were opening the door, and the white neighbor called the cops on them because of, they thought they were thieves or that they shouldn't be there and they were criminals. And I understand that racism is an issue, but what's happening with George Floyd's death has, I feel, blinded a lot of people to embody reasoning. There is this urge to fit in to a group. So if you're not against racism, no, if you don't support the BLM movement, you're against racism. Like, there has been such polarized views that, it's hard to get any nuanced discussion in that landscape. And a lot of times, it happens when there is a need of fitting in. That's what I've noticed. There are people who will outcast you for having alternate views. And, I think social media doesn't help because you talk into an I talked to an echo chamber and I was like,
Right.
why? Like, we're not actually discussing ideas. And with the 280 characters that we have, it makes it really hard for somebody to express their ideas. But I think one person is likely to jump into another conclusion despite what your intentions were. And it's easier to dismiss somebody based on a preconceived idea you have of them versus trying to understand what the discussion is actually about. I think, like, I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, but I do agree with his position on not bombing or going to the Iraq War. At the same time, he also killed Qasem Soleimani, and I'm not a fan of Qasem Soleimani, but it did spark an outrage, and he did kind of do similar things in terms of crossing international borders to kill a government official. But I think a lot of people, because they're so anti-Trump in general, will start supporting opposite ideas. So even if Trump may be right about something, they're kind of like, but it's Trump, he can never be right. So I'm going to
Right.
support other things. And I
Right.
think a lot of that is happening. So if I don't support the BLM movement, because I'm like, well, I don't like violence, I'm not going to support the BLM movement, but I do approve of the sentiment to remove racism, but on all accounts. And people are like, oh, you're just anti-black. And I think that is just an unfair stance to have because we're trying so hard to put labels on people so that we are able to assess them better or discriminate against them better or even just be bigoted.
Yeah. I had a similar circumstance touch me recently, like with COVID-19 coming from China, and like there's been some uh, some social censorship about mentioning China and COVID-19 in the same sentence. People are saying you have to be sensitive to the feelings of Asian Americans. Well, I'm an Asian American, and I criticize China all the time because well, I have family in Hong Kong, and China just passed legislation so it can overturn Hong Kong sovereignty, and China's putting Uyghur Muslims into concentration camps. So um, people who are saying you need to be sensitive to the sentiments of Asian Americans. Well, you don't speak for me. You know, I have my own views on this matter, and well, right now, the only way to get out of this, as far as I can tell, is to stir up more conversation. But the irony is that because of the fear that people will lose friends, jobs, and what have you, it's going to be talked about less. Um, it seems to me that the only way to get a dialogue started is you have to be a member of a minority community to even discuss issues facing that community. But that strikes me as being something that's just incredibly naive and disingenuous. You know, I'm not always a fan of his views, but you know, Ben Shapiro occasionally states facts don't care about your feelings. You know, data is data, logic is logic, and we should be able to take it, compile it as a whole, and just talk about the specifics it brings up in terms of what's working and what isn't. It shouldn't matter what the ethnicity of the person involved in the discussion is. The only thing that matters is that all parties go into the conversation with a mind for discussing things in an honest and ethically responsible fashion. Now, there's a perception that we have to be sensitive to minorities, which is understandable, of course, to a certain degree, but um, beyond a certain point, I don't think it applies. And not all Asians agree on the issues facing China. Not all Muslims agree on Islam. Not all Black people agree on BLM. The default is that the most politically correct choice to fall back on is to protect feelings and assume that everyone in the minority community just falls in line with it. But this is an incredibly arrogant standpoint, and that's bigotry in itself, because if you're outside of the minority or if you're white, you can just dismiss someone by stating they have white privilege or you can't possibly understand something because of my personal experiences. Now, I understand why that's such a very, very enticing narrative, but it just undercuts the idea that we share a common humanity and the ability to relate to one another, which is just divisive. And we've taken disrespect for minorities too far, but it can be just infantilizing. But good input is good input, no matter what it comes from. So where do we stand when it comes between respect and speaking candidly? I mean, I really want to hear your perspective on this because you're an ex-Muslim, but you're also an incredibly successful woman in the STEM fields, and you know, I'm sure you see this weird intersection of ideas come at some point in your life.
Yeah, like I really like that you brought up the STEM field because a lot of things before I was an ex-Muslim activist, I used to talk to a lot of women in engineering, first year university students who have been told that, you know, it's a male-dominated environment and they see it in their classroom. There are more men than there are women. And, you know, more male representations in the workplace as well. And I realized there was a lot of question, there was a lot of fear of what if? There was a lot of fear of like, what do people treat you differently? Do people not listen to you? Is it harder for you to work? And I think the best thing that I could tell them at that point was when you do get into a job, I don't think you should put your gender first. Like, you know, don't feel like somebody's discriminating you because you're a woman unless they've explicitly said that. And I'm not trying to dismiss anybody's experience who have felt like that and somebody hasn't explicitly said that. But I think because we're going in with the idea that we're going to be discriminated, that, you know, we are the victims and we need to continue fighting against it versus why don't we remove the gender factor from it? Why don't we remove the race factor from it when we're giving people civil rights? Now, you know, just going back to BLM and being in the ex-Muslim, not just community, but like being an ex-Muslim, comparing civil rights to what Black Americans have in America and comparing the civil rights to what many Muslims or non-Muslims would have in Muslim majority country, people have equal rights in America. You do have equal civil rights in America, no matter what your color is, what your gender is. And it's quite different when it comes to a country where minorities are not treated right. So countries like Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and a lot of other places where if you're not a local or if you're not a Yemeni, you're never going to get equal rights. You're not going to get equal pay. You're not going to get like the job you want. You're not going to get a permanent residency. You're going to be ill-treated. The government will also not support you if you complain against your employers. I think we're focusing so much on the US and who's saying what versus facts. Like you said, facts don't care about your feelings. Obviously, there is context applied to data. There's always going to be context applied to data. But at the same time, the I think it's important to understand how the data is collected. Are we collecting data only from police reports, or is it just the cases that have been filed? What about cases that were dismissed, or what
Sure.
about cases that have been reported but did not actually people did not get convicted from it? So there is a lot to data that we can draw conclusions from if we do understand what the data is and where it's coming from. But at the same time, it shouldn't matter who's saying it. It is absolutely data. Data is objective, but your perception is subjective. And that will be in any case, whoever you are, whatever your experience is, you will always have a different perspective on it. And you can agree on it if you have rationale behind it. I think in the concept of identity politics, that shouldn't be an issue. Your experience, yes, your experience does shape your worldview, but at the same time, when you're relaying data and you're like, hey, these are the numbers, this is what's happening, it shouldn't matter who says it. I think there's a lot of discrimination coming from if you're a minority, then yes, you can say it. But I realized that even myself being a brown woman, I couldn't talk about the crimes related in the US in neighborhoods that were predominantly black. And there are a lot of reasons for it. So I'm also a socialist where I'm like, well, maybe this neighborhood doesn't have enough funding for education and jobs. And then that creates a negative cycle. Like it is, crimes are related to places, are related to people, they're correlated to people not having enough money or jobs or safer environments. But my word did not have any weighting as a brown person unless a black person said the same thing. And and we could both be saying the same thing, but I would be called a racist or anti-black, even if, according to the far left, if you have any black ancestry, you're black, which I do by 12%. Because, my dad is East African, and I didn't even know how that came into my genes because I don't look like it. But my dad's darker than I am. But yeah, so I guess at that point, it didn't matter if I was 12% black, as long as I fit that, as long as I say what they want me to say, you're going to be shunned. And at the same time, I feel like the far right has used this narrative to be completely bigoted against black people. So looking at how looking at the neighborhood, what that is, that doesn't have good education systems, they're like, oh, well, it's their fault, they're thugs. And sure, like there are crime rates high, but let's start from the problem in the beginning instead of the end. Let's maybe start creating social services in environments that, women feel safer, that, domestic violence is reduced because there are more services for women to reach out in there. There's more aid and support given to them. Let's try, investing more in the education system where we're not creating that negative cycle of not having jobs. But then in the end, I don't know if I know enough about what would happen if we did invest in the education system. Would the reality change by a lot? Would it still be the same? Would we still have the same problem of crime rates? And would that data still, I mean, I think regardless of what changes, identity politics is a downfall to the society. If I can say, if somebody who's black can say the same thing, or a white person can say the same thing, I can too. However, I don't see that happening when white people talk. Nobody has ever told me that I cannot talk on behalf of a white person, ever. So I've only had it with other minorities, but I've also had women, ex-Muslim women and Muslim women talk to white people, be it men or women, saying, well, you're not brown, you're not a Muslim, you don't know my struggles. You don't know what has been happening to me. You cannot talk on behalf of me. As long as it doesn't fit your narrative, you're easy to dismiss the person based on their identity, which I think is crazy. but it's also what fuels the far left, in terms of being quite stagnant, but also quite staunch in their position.
I mean, it's crazy because it's yeah, I have the perspective, and I think a lot of people do share it, in that if you ignore someone's personal experience, it's cruel. But to let their personal experience dominate the whole narrative, that's just disingenuous. I mean, like going back to the example I was giving about Hong Kong and China and COVID-19. I have a friend of mine who's white who explicitly called out China's president and China's human rights abuses, and she was called a racist. I I thought that was absolutely crazy because I mean I'm glad to have people from other ethnicities stand, like, stand with us in this regard, who are concerned with the concerned about moving into a colorblind society in which we want human rights and equal treatment for all, and that we're not going to get there unless we can speak honestly about the issues facing uh, certain communities today, and give other people the benefit of the doubt that we speak on these issues from an ethical standpoint. And it makes me wonder, since, like, as you say, like, if you're not of that ethnicity, then your opinion, however based on objective data it is, just doesn't count, and that's just really pernicious. So it makes me wonder if a true colorblind society. I mean, I personally think it's still possible. I think it's something we should head towards. But with the craziness of the explicit racism on the far right and the social justice extremism on the far left, they just feed right into each other. It just seems that a colorblind society is looking less and less likely by the minute because of um, these two extremities that just feed right into each other. I mean, like, is a colorblind society even possible in your perspective?
Um, as much as I would like to, I don't think so, because it makes me think, what about a genderless society, like a gender blind society? you know, Especially with the trans community, what is happening, not deterring, but for the point, not moving away from the point, but what is happening right now is that the existence of trans people means that women cannot talk about misogyny that they face as being born female. So the same thing can happen with the color blind society as well. If we do remove the color from it, we won't have any race issues to talk about. But at the same time, if one race was being targeted, um, the other people won't be able to talk about it. I don't know if I kind of confused you with that, but I was just trying to think how you can remove, like, if we're going to remove race from the equation, which seems highly unlikely because people are so obsessed with it, can we remove gender from the equation? I know we're getting to a society where people have come up with a lot of pronouns, and I'm happy to accept that, and that's fine, and it's all good. But at the same time, is it actually going to benefit the society to disregard it completely?
Mm.
Um, is it going to help? Are we going to have more constructive conversations about removing it, or removing it completely? Are we going to have enough discussion to talk about what the difference would be if we have it and if we remove it? I don't see, as much as I'd love a colorblind society, I don't see it happening at all.
Yeah,
Interesting.
it's a very difficult future to envision, especially given how people prioritize skin color and race and nationality over just about any other attribute you can think of. I think, and you sort of alluded to this earlier on in the conversation, that there's a huge contradiction in the process of identity politics, where people can create a narrative based on their personal experiences. And if that's the game that we're going to play, then white people can just as easily do the same thing. And when they say that, well, if we're going to, one, we could, not only could we reach racist conclusions from this, but also if you're going to say that your experience as a black person should prioritize my experience as a white person, what is this arbitrary distinction that we're making, that we're basing this off, just on the fact that you're oppressed and I'm not? It's a strange it's a strange thread there that I don't think anyone wants to actually pull on. And there's some topics of conversation that, for some reason, particular communities don't want to have. I mean, for me, for instance, I'm from the Mexican community, and so I pretty much have a free pass to talk about issues within this particular community. But there are some issues that are not being had, that are not being talked about. One of the things that I always mention is the fact that there's this strange um, there's this strange way that Mexicans have of avoiding the conversation about education, and how we don't value education as much as the Asian community or as much as the white community do. And this conversation is only being had among circles that are not Mexican. And this is an important conversation that needs to be had because it's true. Why is it that we constantly score lower than other races on standardized testing? Why is it that we don't that our average GPA is not as high? Why is it that we consistently underperform when we get accepted into universities such as Harvard and Brown and Princeton? There's a reason for this, and this conversation is only being had among circles that are not Mexican, and that is very concerning for me. And this is why I really want a colorblind society to be possible, because it only confuses, it conflates, and it distorts important conversations. So, I guess my question to you would be, if there is no reasonable expectation for us to have a colorblind society, then what is the best possible route that we have in the future? What is the best case scenario for us then?
Oh, that's a difficult one. Like I said, just like you, I would like to have a colorblind society, but then I don't know, I feel like we would have to come up with different forms or different metrics of data to then identify where the problem is or how the problem comes about. I would like to think I'm a culturist. I don't like some aspects of some cultures, including my own culture that I've distanced myself from. And that could be a lot with like losing my faith. But
Mm-hmm.
also being African, there were some things that I saw within the African community or, the native Black community where I was like, I don't like how men treat women in this community. Not that my community was the best, but there were things that I did disagree on. So if we were colorblind and if color didn't matter, do you think that those aspects of culture would be removed then from people?
Mm-hmm.
Um, because I think what is happening right now, and this is what I was just thinking while you were talking about it, a lot of it also comes down to being, the different color does not only represent your skin, it represents a lot of your actions and the culture. For example, when we call out honor-based crime, the stats and the numbers are it is South Asian family, Middle Eastern family, even in the West. And it happens in non-Muslim families as well, but it is quite like the numbers on those are quite high, and we're ready to call them out on it. But why aren't we talking about things like black on black violence? Why aren't we talking about, if we're talking about Black Lives Matter, we have to look at it on different aspects as well. So why aren't we talking about those different things? So if we did actually live in a colorblind society, culture would be important as well. Are we going to talk about the culture? Are we going to highlight where the problem is and where it comes from? Which I think that the common narrative is it's white male who are privileged. So they're countering patriarchy there and they're showing, and they are alluding to white dominance or white superiority. But the reality is that, like I said initially, my family's views or Tanzanian views are based on America, where white are the majority. And the stats, the white on black crimes are counted, but black on black crimes aren't talked about. But the rest of the world, it's not white people ruining it. There's a lot of their own people ruining their own communities. In Pakistan, for instance, it's not white people that are the problem there. This is your own community ruining your own country as well. And I think in order for us to tackle or to proceed with having with not being able to be a colorblind society is to basically call out the culture, to basically identify what are the practices within that culture, within that group of people, or within a country that need to be condemned and why.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think not everybody is ready to have that conversation. Not everybody is. not everybody is able to understand reasons for having that conversation. I think Bruce mentioned it earlier in terms of how that slight reason is undermined by the anger and the aggressiveness of other people. And that's where I think our challenge is to, you know, ignore identity politics, especially from our side. People are still going to call you some kind of an Islamophobe or some label, but if things have to be said, things have to be said. Except, I think, and this I don't know how it would play out, so help me understand this. But when it comes, what I have noticed is when I know somebody who is far right, consistently arguing on anti-immigration laws, and then they talk about um I get no like and then they talk about anti-black views. I am always confused whether to support their fact, whether they've brought up a fact, whether their intention was to solve the problem for the better of all or to solve the problem that only aids white people. So
Hmm.
that's where I'm a little confused in terms of like having that conversation despite what other people label you as. So I don't know how to move forward from that. Sometimes I can take those facts, but knowing that they are part of the far right group, what would I make of those facts? Am I being conducive to their hateful ideas or their conservative ideas, or am I being passive and ignoring even just the facts that they mentioned or talked about? How do you two deal on it? Like,
Yeah, that I actually got into that type of conversation not too long ago with someone on Twitter when he posed the question, "How do you distance yourself from people who are genuinely anti-Muslim bigots? How do you distance yourself from people who are genuinely on the far right?" And it's one of those things where, like, I mean, epistemologically speaking, you can't know someone's true intentions, even if you see a pattern, a noticeable pattern of them very conveniently aligning themselves with the same views that someone on the far right would agree with. There's still, you have to leave room for the best possible interpretation of what it is that they're thinking. So I think the only way you can go about the situation is just go by the strength of their arguments. Because even if they're on the wrong side of history and they align themselves with far right, if their arguments really are as weak as we would expect someone on the far right to be, we should be able to combat them. And that, I mean, that to me is the way I go about the situation. I don't know how you'd go about it, Bruce.
Me, for myself, I try to stay consistent with a core set of values. I mean, if we're going back to the subject of Islam, for instance, that's like if we call out Christianity for its um, the verses and its practices that encourage homophobia and misogyny, then you should be able to do that against something like against fundamentalist Islam. But in your dialogue, in your actions, in your views, you want to stay hew to and demonstrate a moral consistency that people can see, in which like you stick to enlightenment values, you stick to humanistic values, you stick to values that demonstrate that demonstrate a stance against racism, like and you show who you are over a period of time. Like one person who I think does this exceptionally well is Majid Nawaz. If you follow him on social media, if you see him in dialogue, he doesn't hold back from skewering right wing or left wing um, political stances for racism, for inconsistency in value. And to distance yourself from the extremists, that's the best way I know how. As in anything else, you demonstrate leadership. You lead by example. Lead by the example of your words, your actions, and your actions.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
with me, what I tried doing was my first condemnation of BLM was the rioting and the looting. And I'm like, well, I'm against violence, full stop. I don't think we need violence for change. And that came at a backlash at at a backlash saying that you're anti-black or that you support racism because you don't see that this backlash, so this fights and this rioting is important because that's how we've changed history before. And I disagree because one, we're changing now at a faster rate than we had 200 years ago. Every change that took place took years to take place. Every change that wanted to happen took years before it would be approved. And also, as a society, we've been civilized. We have more rules. We have better rules to govern every individual's civil rights, with the exception of some countries and some laws. Um, but living in a democratic government, I think we have the ability to vote and make that change. And I have my own issues with democracy, depending on who the majority is or how democracy would work in different countries. But at the same time, I think an approach to violence is not ever going to be an answer. Although some people think that because we've used violence before, we should be using it again to make changes. And I just think we've progressed like in the society to actually have those ways or methods to make change. And also, it doesn't set a good precedence in the future in terms of us telling the future generation on what we need to make change. We need to yell out to make change versus show evidence or, show reasoning why that change should be there or peaceful protests.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and like I feel like I was still discriminated for having that same value because I'm against corporal punishment anyway. So I'm like, nope, I'm against violence, full stop.
Yeah.
And
And that right there that happened to you is a huge problem, right? Where you made a claim, you made an argument, and for some reason that argument is anti-black because this is what I call the generalization problem, where people associate an argument with the whole group of people. They say that Black Lives Matter is representative of what every single black person believes, and that's just not the case. There are people like Coleman Hughes, Glenn Lowry, John McWhorter. These are high profile black people who have completely heterodox views on the matter. I wouldn't even say actually they're heterodox. For all we know, they're probably the silent majority views. But because the media and people immediately associate a particular viewpoint with a whole group of people, I mean, isn't that racist unto itself? You're basically saying that based on the color of your skin, you have to have a particular viewpoint. That's a huge I don't know. That's what I was thinking of when you said that. It's like how crazy is it that we're immediately calling someone anti-black or anti-Mexican or anti-whatever because you disagree with a viewpoint that you yourself are claiming is representative of every single person of that race.
It's interesting because what that's the problem with some of these social justice movements. It's because they co-opt a slogan, and the slogan itself sounds like something that's fairly benign, but like BLM for that matter. I mean, I'm friends with several members of the black community, and they tell me that even in BLM itself, there are some things they support and there are some things they absolutely condemn. So it's not as clear cut as everyone would like to make it. I mean, because you have some general criticisms, it doesn't mean that you're anti-black. It means like I'm on board with them here, and there's some other aspects that I think are just don't speak for me. I mean, you can't claim to represent the entire views of a community just because you're chanting behind a slogan, because a slogan it's a loaded phrase. It's a lot that comes along with it, and not everyone will have that kind of perspective, and it's just taken on this incredibly religious fervor where people are caught up in sanctimony, and sanctimony overrides reason. But that actually leads into another question I have for you, Zara. Where I've been just very, very disturbed by everything I'm seeing in the news and my social media pages, and on how this narrative is now seems to have the power to actually force some institutional changes that may or may not be desirable. So I've started reaching out to people privately to introduce new points of view because social media is quite often not the best way to do this. And the people I picked out so far are generally well-meaning people who have a view on the edge of wokeness, but these are people who I've had a strong personal relationship with, or people who I've observed to be highly intelligent, of good character. They're well traveled, and most importantly, they're able to see nuance in a variety of different conversations that I've had with them. Um, Now, the conversations I've had in my own personal life about this particular matter, they've gone reasonably or sometimes even exceptionally well. And to my surprise, these are people who are a little bit further along of what the three of us think of as woke. And it was, to me, it was just a really, really interesting experience because looking at their expressions when I told them about just the craziness of what happened to Brett Weinstein, social justice extremism, the insanity that's just been tuned up by faux grievance studies. They had no idea how crazy I'd gotten, and they told me they hadn't seen it from that angle before. This pointed out two things for me. It tells me that reasoning people out of this social justice extremism is still possible, and well, something that we are. My second point is something that we all really know. Social media is the worst area to have this conversation from. That tells me that we can still have these conversations. That tells me people are still willing to look at nuance. Now, what has it been like for you in your own personal life? Are you still able to talk about this with people one on one? Are they receptive to your views? Yeah.
I think it would depend who I'm talking to. Um, I feel like a lot of my friends who are white are all like they have generally adopted the view that they're privileged for being white. That's, they're like, oh, it's so unfair. I've never had an issue, but other black people always have this constant issue. And I'm like, that's not true. If you were in Africa, you would, yes, be denied a job sometimes, or maybe you'd be fetishized and have it. So sometimes they're like, oh, we didn't know that perspective existed. But still, here in the UK, I think that some people are unable to see the full context of it or a different perspective of it, only because their experience is limited. Especially, I feel like traveling and talking to different people or being around different parts of the world, or think, the common propaganda that, numbers are there, but they're biased. Surveys are not done in unbiased, like an unbiased way. But, for the most part, a lot of the people, especially within the ex-Muslim community, a lot of the younger ex-Muslims have been so outraged about it. And, you know, um, a lot of the people have not actually, like, I come from an experience where I have lived in the UK, in Australia, in Malaysia, and in Tanzania, and I have seen completely different. Like, Malaysia had the worst racism ever that I have seen, but nobody bothered calling that out. All they have been doing is being against white people, and I feel like that's unfair to me to support because my experience has been completely different with white people. And sure, there are people who have abused brown people and myself and are far right. But at the same time, majority of the attacks that I've received are from other brown people, other Asians, and black people. And if we're talking about experiences and how that builds up to having that conversation, I feel like I was shut down from it. um, I was, I have been ostracized. I saw my close friends unfollowing me, blocking me, and none of it was based on integrity at all. Like, having known me for so long, you should know that I don't have any malicious intent, that I am not a white supremacist or a white leaning activist, I guess.
Right.
I've always tried positioning myself as being center left, um, and, even in terms of like things like bringing Shamima Begum back, I've always gone like, yes, I think we should bring her back. No, I don't think we should let her out in the free world. I feel like I try being consistent in my moral views, but I don't get the same, I guess, courtesy. And maybe that has a lot to do with canceling my I guess it has a lot to do with me opposing the woke view. And if they're woke, I am against everything, and that I've made my bed, and I should sleep in it. I think that's the common phrase that I've gotten to shut down any conversation, that people are unable to tackle a position from different angles. For instance, white guilt. I had never known of the term until I moved to the UK, And I think it was a flatmate who went like, "Oh yeah, I've had things relatively easy." And I'm like, "Sure, but there are a lot of white people who've had it harder than I have, and I have personally had things easier." Um, but they were just feeling really guilty, and it was when I met Armin Navabi, who told me similar feelings when he spoke to other white people, that they were guilty of their race. And I realized that this phenomenon was quite common in the US than it was anywhere else, especially talking to a lot of my friends who are Americans. Um, I think it was really hard to find somebody who was centrist in their view and didn't feel guilty about it. And yeah, I have personally lost a few friends as well, um, including like some of my close friends, ex-Muslims, but also people outside the ex-Muslim community.
Yeah, I've noticed how like the recent circumstances have just really split not just the ex-Muslim community, but also just people in general. Uh, I'm I'm really curious as to like how much do you think scholastic ignorance factors into this? Like people are or seem to be fixated on white guilt and racism against white people uh, because of the West's imperialist past. But every single culture has been imperialist at some point. There hasn't been a single human culture on Earth that hasn't participated to some degree. We just happen to be in an era of history where the West is dominant. Now, the cultural aspect that you're most known for is the controversy surrounding Islam, specifically the hijab. Um, a few years ago, there's an awful incident that happened near where I live, in which we had a young Muslim girl who was attacked by a racist on a college campus. He tore her hijab off. He assaulted her. Now, all of us in the community, we rose up in solidarity with her, and was just awesome to see. But somewhere along the line, that hijab became the symbol of a minority status. And the hijab in fundamentalist Islam is enforced modesty culture originated by men. And in Muslim majority countries, women can be beaten or have acid thrown in their faces for not wearing it. Now, it really was and is a system of oppression, a symbol of oppression, I'm sorry, but it's hypocritically celebrated now, especially those on the woke left. Um, in my conversations, being center left myself, and most people who lean further left or who fall into the mid to far right category are just really ignorant about the differences and struggles of liberal and conservative Muslims, and they just think Islam is just another religion to be criticized like another. Now, despite claiming to be one or the other, left or right, most of these people can't tell me anything about the specifics of Islam. They can't even tell me about what it actually means to be a liberal or conservative. They have no idea of the depth of some of these concepts. Now, is part of what we're seeing a failure of our education system, and like we're just caught up in self-righteous fury as a result because we don't have the depth of knowledge that we need to be able to look at these matters objectively and from a nuanced standpoint. I mean, I'm certainly finding that to be the case with people on the left and the right that I speak to. They just don't know the fine slices.
I think a lot of it is not just the education system, but the fear of being labeled a bigot or an Islamophobe, which has caused a lot of people their jobs. They've caused a lot of people a lot of distress, labeling happening. And I think a lot of times the people who are supporting hijab don't even, like you said, know specifics of Islam. They don't even know what the hijab is meant, it represents, what it has done. And when it comes to, when you ask them the question about women in Iran, they're like, yeah, but that's a different story. But that's somebody else's. And like Iran is an authoritative government. It's Saudi Arabia, completely negating that women in the West also don't have a choice. And understanding, I think they lack the understanding what a choice means, and that women, or girls rather, are forced to wear it at the age of 5 to 8, and they continue on from it. They don't know how they're being taught or what they're taught when they wear the hijab, but still end up celebrating it in solidarity for women who have been discriminated. At the same time, I am not against representation of women in women who wear hijab in, let's say, icons like Airbnb icons or um, modeling or a lot of other um, places where we would see them being portrayed in the media. I used to be opposing that because I thought that we're celebrating the hijab. But what occurred to me is a completely different narrative where, as a girl who did wear a hijab when I was young, I couldn't see I think at the time I didn't see many people in politics or many people in other powerful position wearing hijab. And that was my reality. Until I was 16, I didn't know you could remove a hijab and be a Muslim or like you could ever leave Islam. But that was my reality. And I feel like there are millions of other young girls who have that reality and aren't given an opportunity to see somebody as a role model. A lot of influencers right now have come out. They were hijabi influencers, and I used to follow them religiously even after I took off my hijab. I just really liked it. And I'm like, oh, maybe when I wear it, I'll wear it like that. This was when I was like kind of falling out of religion, but it helped knowing that there are people out there in a leadership position who do wear the hijab. Although, when you're an adult and you look at what it does represent as an adult Muslim woman, and how much oppression it has caused, it's really hard to be supportive of the hijab. So I feel like I guess I'm a little not confused, but I have two different opinions of it and how a person would look at it because we don't want to, I guess we don't want to remove the representation that younger kids can look up to because that is their reality. That is what they've always known, like myself. Like I was a little girl once and I didn't know anything about it, anything more than, people who wear the hijab can't dance or people who wear the hijab are not allowed to listen to music or anything. And that are Islamic laws, dancing and music isn't allowed. But, to see a ballerina who's wearing a hijab is like, oh my God, she did it. So I can do it. And I can only hope that when these girls grow up, that they truly know what it means and what choice it hasn't given them, and the choice to remove it comes at a larger cost, but always worth it. Um, at the same time, I don't know. It is really hard for many Muslim women who don't wear the hijab and seeing other non-Muslims wear the hijab and celebrate it. And in return, the backlash that those Muslim women get from not wearing the hijab is, oh, did you see that non-Muslim woman wearing the hijab? Maybe you should wear it too. So it can come at like, it can represent something good, but at the same time, it can represent something very harmful as well. And that's a really hard line to draw. And I think that even on the Faithless Hijabi page, when I post up things like I am not like, I do not celebrate the hijab, but I do celebrate a woman who thinks she has a choice to it. If she truly feels like
Mhm.
she has a choice to it, great. Because what is worse is me policing other women and telling them you can't wear it because it's misogynistic. I think the best way to do it is giving them an informed opinion on it and leaving it up to them. Then they're adults and they choose it.
See what you gave right there was an incredibly nuanced way of looking at the issue, and this is what we need more of, not less of, in this environment, because it's like you described. The whole thing is a huge, complicated mess, and we're not going to get to that if we can't speak frankly, and by giving someone the best possible interpretation of what they say.
Yeah, I think, like I said, a lot of times people want to see it as black and white, and I was once there. I actually was a person who was, I wouldn't say far left because I didn't know anything about political landscapes. I didn't even know what the
Right.
right was or the left, but I used to be that person who wouldn't wear a hijab because I got to remove it. It came at a lot of criticism, but I thought that was normal. I thought that was expected and accepted as well. But then, when I had a friend talking about the hijab and how it's not a choice, and I'm like, no, my sisters choose to wear it. We're not oppressed. We had the choice. But what I realized is it was the only choice given to us. It was the only choice that was acceptable for us to take. I can't imagine any of my sisters taking off their hijab in Tanzania, and I have a sister in the UK, but she's comfortable wearing it. She's not oppressed. I think my story is quite different from many other ex-Muslims. Is I got more rights than my brother. I got to study. My brother didn't have that choice because he was the first son, so there were a lot of responsibilities.
Oh wow.
But at the same time, like I accomplished a lot more than many of my family members, but I also, wasn't restricted for it. It wasn't easy. It didn't come to me easy. I had my mother telling me that there wasn't any point to me studying because I'd only be a mom and I'd have to quit my job. And, I'm a wife and I am going to be somebody's property. I'm either my dad's daughter or my husband's wife. And at that point, I was 14 and I was like, when do I become my own person? And at the age of 19, I was actually applying for my master's. So I was still doing my bachelor's and I was applying for my master's. And my mom's like, why do you need to study more? Like, what are you going to do anyway? You're just going to get married soon. And I'm like, watch me. So it was it was really interesting when when I got my job at Google and I was flying around and they were like, "Oh, so this is what a degree gives you." And I'm like, for some people, yes. I mean, I earned my own way to it, but they are now seeing that payback. So they're now seeing how I guess I have made things sound very easy for them with the career path that I've chosen, but they're seeing the possibilities of what somebody can do. And I think I'm the one who's truly independent from my whole family. That I've never like they've never had any issues with me. I've always been responsible. So despite being the black sheep in terms of coming out as an atheist and an activist, I've also been the golden child. So whenever I am talking to a lot of younger ex-Muslims, I'm always like, please study, like, do some form of a degree, online e-courses, because they will so help you in any point. And I feel like, so many women haven't been taught to do it. They haven't been taught to seek out for it. They don't know where to start. They've never heard of things like Coursera or Udemy that have cheaper courses, and
Right.
it's a start. It's like £20 for something. It's a start. It's great. Let's do it. Um, so I'm
Well,
really hoping that as we go along that we can continue building and helping other women know that they can totally do this.
that's why representation is so important. That's why you're doing is so important because you're a symbol and an example for those for these young girls who see what it's possible to accomplish out there. And I love your story and just I love hearing about just how much you were able to accomplish. And I'm kind of chuckling in the background because Vince and I are both friends with Armin Navabi and Ali Rizvi. And the first time I saw you was on that one Secular Jihadists episode. I think you were the first guest who I saw really push back and demanded of Ali and Arman online. I was just laughing in the background because I thought that was just a really interesting counterpoint. And oh, Zara's tough.
Yeah.
Um, the other thing
Yeah,
is, and this was something that me and another ex-Muslim discussed, is that a lot of times we hear about Muslims being shunned, ex-Muslims being shunned from their families for leaving, but we don't hear as much about ex-Muslims who do have their families.
yeah,
We've never explored it, and somehow we're considered to be lucky versus normal. We're made to feel guilty or privileged for having that. And I think it's only recently that I'm starting to unaware feeling that I'm lucky and considering it to be normal, because I feel like there's, like you said, a representation that isn't out there, that a lot of people, and I've always been like, I had struggles with my family. They don't fully accept me, but I get that. I don't fully accept them. I don't like their religion, but I accept them for who they are, but I don't like the aspects of, let's say, something like male circumcision or um, things like, you know, having religion more important than other decisions. But I feel like my family are slowly changing and accepting of different ideas. They're not leaving religion, but they're understanding that there is a bigger world out there that they haven't seen or acknowledged. But
right.
I think that is missing in the ex-Muslim community. We don't often talk about it because, it's one of those things that we're not able to have a nuanced discussion about it. we're not able to see a different perspective for it because it always has to be so polarized. You either are a closeted ex-Muslim and you have your family, or you are an ex-Muslim who's out there and don't have your family. And
Hmm.
that's really hard. And I feel like Sarah Hayder is also one of the people who has a good relationship. And, it came at a cost of her losing her friends and cousins. And so did I. But at the same time, we still have some form of love and relationship with our families. And, when I was actually in the Secular Jihadist podcast, I actually mentioned that I disowned my family. So I basically sent them a message saying, what I'm about to do is quite dangerous, and I don't want anybody to know we're related, so you're not hurt, and I just need some space, maybe for a couple of years, and I'll come back. But if you want to text, just give me a few more months so I can think about it. And after that podcast with Secular Jihadists, because it was aired live to non-patrons later, I had another podcast that was live, and my brother watched the entire 2.5 hour podcast, and he messaged me saying, I saw your podcast. We really want to be in your life. And that's how we started preparing the relationship. And there was a lot of, I'm not comfortable listening to this, or you can't talk to me that way. There was a lot of boundary learning on both sides. But I don't think it's often talked about because a lot of times people are so scared that they will lose their relationship. And rightfully so. Everybody has just painted one picture there.
Hmm.
Um,
I
everybody
see.
is, and I think, people are scared to disappoint their parents, but apart from religion, there are other ways people disappoint their parents, and sometimes you still have their love, even if it's a bit, I guess it's even if it's not the ideal thing that you were looking for. But I think we're just missing that picture in the ex-Muslim world, and I'm constantly trying to post up more family stuff, more, hey, this is good for me, this is nice, this is what happened. Um, and people say, "Oh, you're very lucky," and I'm like, I wish it wasn't the case. I really wish it wasn't the case. I really hope that um, more ex-Muslims get that. I really hope that it becomes normalized, um, and I hope that we go into that tangent. But yeah, the idea is to create more stronger female um, in the ex-Muslim world and like have them speak out, which is why I have the podcast as well, which is not only female, but which is why I feel like the podcast is a great way for one, them to vent out, two, for all of us to learn. Um, and also, we started Support Corner, which is specific topics that we discuss. So it's not a one-on-one therapy, it's a one-to-all kind of therapy in a way. We all talk about how to get over the fear of hell, what would you do when you feel guilt and shame? And we have different topics happening in Arabic as well, for the Arabic audience. But yeah, no, that first podcast had changed my life. Like I said, I wasn't planning to be an activist at all. I was just like, I'm going to talk. I love talking, and they were friendly, and we just had a good time. And then what happened the next week was a lot of death threats that came my way. I was so scared. I didn't know how to handle it. And then what happened was I kind of had to make a decision. Like I could either shut down my profile and not talk to other people about it, or I could keep going. And after my profile with those death and rape threats, what came were a lot of
Yeah.
other ex-Muslims messaging me. They're like, "Oh, I am having doubts, or I don't think I believe in God, and my story isn't out there." And that's when I created like a platform where they could share their stories. And then we started sharing those stories, and that was helpful for a lot of them. It was therapeutic for them to write as well. But there weren't enough, I guess there wasn't enough of like of a representation of just women issues because in Islam, women are the most oppressed. It is worse if you were gay. Um, but at the same time, there's a lot of systematic oppression that really happens in Islam, that people haven't highlighted as much, that there aren't a lot of people talking about it. There aren't people like me who weren't forced to stay at home or on house arrest. but also had to go through a lot of the emotional abuse in terms of, my mother breaking my heart by saying I am only going to be a mom and I shouldn't study. And I was a complete different person. I was so motivated to get outside the house and be independent. And it was really hard. It was this honor-based abuse. So it was the honor-based abuse that we don't talk about. Like yesterday I gave a
Right.
presentation on what honor-based abuse is, and a lot of times we think it's honor killing, it's hurting somebody physically or psychologically, but a part of something that we haven't explored is how honor-based abuse is also controlling, specifically your daughter's lives in the name of honor or sexual purity. So a lot of girls are being monitored that they don't talk to boys, and that happened to me as well. Um, and I'm sure it's going to happen to my sisters who are younger and my niece. And that's honor-based abuse. We just don't realize it, or we don't take it as abuse. We usually see the very extreme forms of it, like FGM, forced marriages, and honor killings. But everything that happens in the background, it's kind of like we don't acknowledge it. Um, the honor killing is probably at the last step when all of these measures have been taken. So honor-based abuse happens over a long period of time and induced by the women in the family as well, who have internalized how they view themselves and how they view honor upon themselves of the family. Sorry, that
Well,
was
well.
a little deviation.
Oh no,
But
that's
That was
absolutely
perfect.
fantastic. Yeah.
That was fantastic. Yes.
yeah, I mean, I know Bruce from, I remember from the Secular Jihadist podcast. Definitely remember that name.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, no, yeah, it has been about almost 2 years. Wow.
Oh,
Been that long.
It, it feels
wow.
so long. It feels so long. I mean, I am just really proud to see Faithless Hijabi grow. Like a lot of times I don't talk about my story. So I talk about like the secular jihadist was all about me, 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 me. And then after that, I was like, I like listening to other people. My story isn't exciting enough. It's it's not
No,
that.
no, it's important. Your story is an important one that should get out
Yeah,
there.
yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, that's true. But I don't know, like when I opened Faithless Hijabi, it just made so much sense to have other people. Like it was like every time I have a podcast, I sometimes end up crying. So I'm like, oh my God, I went through that as well. Or like, that is horrible. Women put under house arrest, abused, almost killed or strangled. And I'm like, oh my God, these are horrible. But then also, what we have happening on Sunday is a couple who were going to talk about raising secular kids and having Muslim parents. So things like these are always so interesting to me to see how different dynamics work within ex-Muslims as well. And um, I guess it really helps knowing that, there's a whole spectrum of ex-Muslims. Like the only thing that connects us is that we've left Islam. And then, even when it comes to political ideas, we're quite different.
Right.
Um,
Hmm.
which is possibly why I lost a few friends. But I guess all well and good. I like to maintain healthy boundaries. So
Yeah. Well, Zara, I want to thank you endlessly for coming on the podcast. It's been an absolute honor to host you. Your story is absolutely fantastic, and you're incredibly intelligent, and you have so much to say, and that's absolutely fantastic. Where can people find you, your organization? What is anything that you want to publicize? Or, yeah.
yeah, well, it's Zara Kay on Twitter, Facebook, which I'm banned, by the way. I was
Nice.
banned on Facebook for receiving threats, and I just went like, some Pakistani Muslims have raided my Facebook. And they're obsessed with my genitals and that of my mom. And that's what I was banned for. And then Facebook reversed removing the post, but they did not unban me. So, yeah, this is not
Wow.
the first time. This is not the first time at all. I remember calling out somebody, and I think they were an ex-Muslim who was an anti-Muslim bigot, and I'm like, you're crazy. or like, are you insane? And I got banned for that because it was like, you're
Nice.
bullying this person. And I'm like, he just said all Muslims are terrorists. Why would you not? Like, why would you not? Like, I don't get it. I don't get it. And I was like,
These platforms have learned nothing.
yeah. I mean,
So
I'm hoping that they will change with a lot of this. But I'm trying to get it restored. I had somebody try helping in contact. But yeah, no, I am still available on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. That's all I have. I was gonna say TikTok, but I don't use it. It's just I'm too old for it.
Oh
I am
God.
too old for it. I am too old for it.
Yeah.
And Faithless Hijabi, we have a website. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And obviously YouTube. Support my channel.
All right. All the links to everything that you just said is in the description of the video below. Go ahead, everyone, check it out. I highly recommend it. Once more, thanks for coming to the podcast. You're always welcome back on, and this was a fantastic conversation.
thank you, Zara.